Welcome everyone to this very special midday session with internationally celebrated author Richard Louv, which we have named Shifting the Climate Narrative, the Real Power of People. Rich has graciously agreed to spend time with us today, reflecting on the powerful role and contribution each of us individually and collectively make daily in our neighborhoods, towns, and cities through the work that we do, improving quality of life and addressing climate issues and opportunities. But first, I'm happy to say that I've known Rich a long while now, and I am a proud owner of hardback signed version, first edition, The Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder. This is the book that changed the conversation about access to nature around the globe. Rich also addressed our industry back in 2009 in partnership with Western Chapter ISA at the Urban Forestry Future Perfect workshops at UCLA and at UC Berkeley. I know lives were changed then. So thanks, Rich, for joining us. Anything you'd like to say before the interview begins?
Well, first, Nancy, you have a copy of the first edition and I don't. So what's wrong with this picture? I gave all mine away. So
An early fan, I guess.
You and I have talked about urban forestry for a long time. And you educated me when you were in San Diego about that. And I wrote about you in my newspaper column. It's interesting now how much more important it seems. It was always important, urban forestry. But now you can't do a Google search, a Google News search without climate change, for instance, or biodiversity collapse, or any other of the unpleasantnesses that we are enduring, without something coming up about trees, and then secondarily something coming up about urban forests and the role that urban forests play in any of those. It's one of the few things that is a multiple solution. Planting more trees absorbs carbon, it improves psychological well-being among children and adults. It's beautiful, it increases the property values. There's a long list of things that it does, and it also increases the chances that biodiversity will have some kind of chance of getting to a point where it's somewhat healthy again. So you're really in the most important business there is, the people at this conference, in terms of trees, because it touches so many other things.
Okay, well, that we appreciate that, and especially with this focus where we're trying to better appreciate the efforts that we all are making. And when we're in the trenches, we often miss that, just through the business of our day. But based on that, what is leadership to you?
Too often, I think leadership is defined, particularly in national politics, particularly in the last few years, as someone who has all the answers, that only I can solve this. And actually, no one person can even get close to scratching the surface of what we face right now. So leadership is a collective process. Sometimes some people can spark that in other people. Nancy, you're one of those people that seems to be able to spark that in other people. But nobody solves anything alone. And so leadership really is a process. It's not a person.
Why do seemingly small acts matter?
Well, in the most recent book that I wrote about our relationship with other animals, the name of it is Our Wild Calling. I interviewed a guy who teaches people bird language, and named John Young. And he has this theory that, and it's not only his theory, this is an old idea, and certainly indigenous people understood it and still understand it, that whatever we do, we send out ripples. When we enter a forest, we send out ripples. Our attitude, our movements, the sounds we make, and other animals, and also plants, also trees, interpret those. The ripples reach them. And so in that sense, they're big acts are made up of 1,000 small acts. All acts are important. And we have to be conscious of the ripples we send out. For instance, a cocktail party, when you enter the room, it changes. When you enter a forest, it changes. So that's why all of these acts that we do are important, sometimes unconsciously important.
So following up on that then, what does the earth require of us now?
Well, it requires us, and this is oversimplistic, it requires us to pay attention, to notice. And most of the time, we're not noticing nature. We see it as a nice view, as scenery. It was interesting. I looked at some literature about Frederick Law Olmsted that many of your folks know about, all of your folks know about, the great park designer, Central Park and others. And when he talked in the early days, I have an enormous respect for him. He is extremely important. But he talked about nature as scenery. It's not scenery. That's only a thin veneer of what's important about it. We're part of nature. I think when we don't pay attention to it, when we treat it like a thing, like scenery, rather than as a process, rather than as something that we're part of, then we're not doing what nature requires of us. And I have a lot more to say about that probably as we go through the discussion.
Feel free to bounce back to that at any point too. So you've been quoted as saying, when we consider the social capital of a community, why do we consider only one species? And that nature can be a civilizing force. Please say more about that.
Well, some of the research, let me say something about the research. When I wrote Last Child in the Woods, there were about 60 studies that I felt comfortable citing in the book about either the disconnect between children and nature, which we all knew in 2005, most of us sensed was going on, but we really didn't have words to use to have a conversation about it. Only 60 studies. To me, this is literally the elephant in the room. In the academic world, was virtually ignoring it, not asking those questions. There are a few pioneers that were doing that in the academic world. So only 60 studies, something so important as how the natural world affects human development, beginning in childhood. Today, if you go to the Children Nature Network website, you'll see abstracts for over 1,000 studies, and they're still coming in 10, 15 a month from somewhere in the world. It's now become a growth industry to study this topic. And the Children in Nature Network is the nonprofit that grew out of Last Child in the Woods. It's childrenandnature.org. We have a big free research library that anybody in the world can go to and learn about this. Some of the studies of those over 1,000 studies that now exist show that violence in neighborhoods with a lot of natural habitat in those neighborhoods, violence is reduced. not in all neighborhoods, but in some. And even domestic violence seems to be decreased. It has a calming effect on us. Uh, my feeling about social capital is usually defined as, for instance, how many people can you call if you get in trouble? If you end up in jail, how many people can you call to help you get out of jail? That's your social capital. That's who you can rely on to come and care about you. And that's only one definition. It's the web that is around us that holds us in society, and it's made up of people according to the current definition. I would argue that we're surrounded by species that are part of our social capital. When we lived in San Diego before we moved to Julian up here in the mountains, we redid our backyard in native species. My wife did. And we were amazed at how many species showed up we'd never seen before. Native California butterflies. There were always lizards there, but now there were a lot of lizards. And I would sit there at my computer and I'd look out the glass door and I'd see the lizards out there doing their push-ups. You know, there's more posturing in my backyard than there is in the U.S. Congress. And when I looked out there, they made me laugh. That makes me healthier. That's part of my social capital. Now they may not know that they're part of my social capital, but certainly I'm part of theirs if I protect them. And they make me laugh. They make me healthier just knowing they're there. So, you know, as we go forward, even trees are not just even, maybe especially trees are part of our social capital. The more research that is done on how trees communicate in mysterious ways, how they affect us, our health, our well-being, they're definitely part of our social capital. And all the critters that live in them are also. When we perceive that, for instance, in a city, the city becomes much richer in our mind, much more interesting, and we don't feel quite as alone.
That's a good definition of a civilizing force. Okay, so what changes have you seen over the past 15 plus years since The Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder was published?
There were a lot of people working on this hard long before Last Child came out. It sometimes gets given too much credit, which actually I don't mind, but the truth is a lot of people were working on connecting our kids to nature. The problem is they weren't honored very much for their work. It wasn't perceived as important as it really is, or at least not by most of the public. I think one of the major changes is that attitude has changed. Now I think that there are, you really can't pick up a publication or look at a website anywhere near related to what we're talking about and not see the importance of connecting kids to nature. The conservation organizations, environmental organizations, when I wrote Last Child, many of them were kind of giving lip service to kids. They were kind of using kids, like, hey kids, go home and tell your parents to recycle. But in terms of actually connecting them physically, emotionally, spiritually to the natural world, there wasn't a lot of that going on, or some. Now all of the conservation organizations that I'm aware of, at least the big ones, all have some kind of program to do that. One of the biggest changes is, I already mentioned, the huge increase in the amount of research, which in 2005 was virtually being ignored up until then. Now it's over 1,000 studies still coming in from somewhere in the world. There was a study done a few years ago, about 4 years ago, I think. It replicated some research that Stephen Keller at Yale had done about American attitudes toward nature. And they compared the findings, more recent findings, to what Keller found. And one of the things they discovered is that within about a decade, the the value that particularly parents place on nature, the connection they make between their kids' experience in nature and their kids' health has skyrocketed. That's a big change. What they also found, though, is that the barriers to nature have not been reduced very much. We got a long way to go. And some of those barriers have gotten worse. You know, we're now handing iPads and iPhones to infants, whereas in 2005, it was still toddlers. So there's been a lot of change, a movement, a kind of movement that I kind of imagined in the second to the last chapter in Last Child. It was wishful thinking that maybe a movement would emerge to connect the next generation to the natural world. And like I say, that was wishful thinking. Well, it happened, and it's now international. I've spent a lot of time in other countries, and it's really quite amazing. But again, we got a long way to go.
I'm kind of stunned right now, so you have to give me a second. So, okay, to build on that, what do you see the next 15 years bringing, and how must public servants and community-based groups contribute to that vision?
Well, one of the most important things that needs to happen is to reimagine cities. As of 2008, more people lived in the world in cities than in the countryside. That demarcation, 2008, is a huge moment. It's headed for 80% of human beings are going to be living in cities very shortly. That means one of two things. Either human beings will continue to lose whatever connection they still have to the natural world, or it means the beginning of a new kind of city. Some of those cities already exist in pieces. And this isn't a new idea. Frederick Olmsted was all over this. The Garden Cities movement in the early 20th century. None of these are new ideas. The suburbs were created with the idea of having more nature in people's lives. It didn't quite work out that way. There's a movement now it's been around for a while, the new urbanism, and I gave a keynote speech to the Congress of the New Urbanism a few years ago. And what I learned was that among the new urbanists, who are great, who are putting front porches, they're bringing back front porches, they're bringing back walkable neighborhoods and all of that. But you brought up nature in the cities and they got kind of nervous. Not all of them, some of them were really onto this, but a lot of them, they were uncomfortable with that idea. And I finally understood why when I talked to quite a few of them, is that they associate, many of the new urbanists associate nature with the failed suburbs. And so they don't want anything to do with the failure of the suburbs in terms of nature. Even in the suburbs, for instance, in San Diego, the planned communities, the gated communities that have open space, that have green, just try to step on that green. Just try to let your kids build a tree house or a fort. It's not going to happen. The condo police will come and take you away. So that's not exactly what we have in mind when we think about the future of cities, I don't think, in terms of the relationship with nature. However, what has grown rapidly just in the last few years is the idea of biophilic design, biophilic architecture, urban design and architecture, which means weaving nature into the plan in the beginning, the architecture or the city, and then keeping it there. The workplaces that have been designed with biophilic design, nature woven throughout them, they've been found to, the impacts are increased productivity, increased creativity, less sick time, better turnover. It improves just about everything. Schools that have moved in, have greened themselves, have more trees around them, have school gardens, have natural play spaces. Test scores go up standardized test scores go up. Two big studies, one in Massachusetts, I think about 600 schools, another one ongoing in Chicago, very urban schools. Comparing the schools that have been greened, and I don't mean solar panels, I mean green, compared to schools that have not. And then also comparing schools that were not green that became green. In both those cases, standardized test scores go up significantly. What if whole cities could be that way? What if whole cities could be more productive, more creative, healthier, physically, psychologically? And that involves a lot more natural settings in those cities. And I'm not necessarily talking about soccer parks, soccer fields. I'm not talking against soccer fields because they could be surrounded by native species, you know, in the edges. But to the extent that we can use biophilic design and biophilic ideas to reinvent the cities we already live in, that's one of the most important things that all of these organizations and agencies and government and the rest of us can do. Some of us starting in our own backyards, like, you know, my wife replanted our yard.
Right. Well, and it's interesting what you say, because what we see is desire for that, understanding of it more and more, but the cost of it for cities, and then the follow-up care, the maintenance of a tree, a park, street trees, cities who are often the responsible parties just don't have the money and or prefer to prioritize other things. So that's, and especially now with the drought, we're seeing it more and more. So it's a big lift. And so the next question then would be, how do we influence those in power to make the needed investment to get to the biophilic city, to make that difference?
You know, one of the big things that prevents parents from letting their kids go outside is the fear of risk. And it's a parallel issue here. There is risk outdoors. There's expense outdoors. But there's a much greater risk of sitting on a couch during your formative years, of obesity, of you know, heart trouble later in life. It will follow you for the rest of your life. That kind of sedentary lifestyle. It takes some investment up front to save a whole lot of money later.
Right.
Just as we have to think about risk in terms of comparative risk, we have to think about expense as comparative expense. Compared to what? Yeah, it's expensive up front, but look at the long-term costs. I have a friend who lives around the corner. He's a former fire chief, and it drives him nuts. We live in a very fire sensitive area east of San Diego. It drives him nuts that there are helicopters and airplanes and pilots that are available right now that could be pinpointing fires almost immediately after they start and putting them out, including at night. And we say we can't afford it. And yet billions and billions and billions of dollars and lives, hundreds, maybe thousands sooner or later of lives are lost because we don't make that investment. Far more is lost in the long run than the investment up front. One of the things that's happening is the Children in Nature Network is partnering with the National League of Cities, which is represents about 18,000 mayors and other city officials around the country. And we're working on some pilot cities. And the question that we're asking is, what does it mean to be a nature-rich city? The second question is, how do you measure that over time, the changes you make in order to make that city nature-rich? And then thirdly, how do we train future mayors to do that? Future city leaders, urban leaders of all kinds to do that. We're finding some real success in terms of how people in different agencies start to talk about this, how the public starts to perceive it. suddenly that natural play space at the school that's built, it's not just for the kids, it's for the neighborhood during the weekend to use also. Many of these neighborhoods have very little green in them. In terms of the expense, there's access to the natural world, including in cities, is literally a matter of life and death. In 2017, there's a study published in The Lancet, a very prestigious journal, health journal, medical journal, and it suggested that people who live in green neighborhoods live longer than those with very little nature nearby. There's study after study after study that illustrates this is literally a matter of life and death. To have trees around, to have nature in some fashion around. Think of the waste of money right now that is being spent on healthcare that wouldn't normally need to be spent if the environment in which kids were growing up was greener.
And you and I both had that as kids.
Yeah.
And we tried to give it to our kids to some extent, successfully. Yeah. Well, Rich, any closing thoughts? Of course, we endlessly appreciate your time here today, but any punctuation marks on this interview?
Well, you asked earlier what it would take to move this conversation forward, or the conversation that many of the people at your conference are already leaders in. It's the same question as we have to apply to climate change. What I refer to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse, which are the climate emergency, biodiversity collapse, pandemics, which are related to those things, and lastly, human loneliness. I include that because until we deal with human loneliness, as well as the other three, if we're not dealing with all four of those at the same time, we're not going to get there. We're not going to make any progress. In 2019, the Great Fires in Australia, images came out of those fires across continents. We watched on television and on YouTube images of people in those great fires caused by climate change. Some of those people had lost their own homes, but they got on their bikes or walked into the fire to take food to the animals who lived in that forest. Again and again, we saw that. It was very moving. It spoke well of our race or of our species. Not much speaks well of our species lately, but that did. There's an Australian eco-philosopher named Glenn Albrecht that I'm friends with, and he says that, why is it, he asks the same question I do, why is it that we don't move faster, haven't moved faster on climate change and these other biodiversity collapse and these other things? And he points to the great social movements that have succeeded to a degree, which are feminism, gay rights, civil rights to an extent, and he named several others. The ones that succeed, the ones that move people from information to action, are all about relationship. They're all about love, as corny as that sounds. And what are we trying to change things with? Data, scientific reports. We need all the data and all the scientific reports we can get, but we already have enough if we stopped right now. What we don't have is that emotional connection to the earth, the emotional connection to nature, the emotional connection, in fact, to each other, that is going to be necessary to move us from data to action. The second thing that is missing, I believe, is what I call imaginative hope. It's not blind hope. It's conjuring up images of a future that we would want to go to. Martin Luther King said, or demonstrated in many ways, that any movement, any culture will fail if it cannot paint a picture of a world that people will want to go to. We've been failing at that. The best we can come up with is sustainability. Oh, that's exciting. I mean, I'm all for sustainability, but really think about that. William McDonough, the great designer, says, do you really want a sustainable marriage? Don't you want something better than that? Sustainability sounds like the language here. It sounds like just sustaining, just getting by, just surviving. That's not enough to get us where we need to go. We have to be able to imagine beautiful cities, great schools, great workplaces, places that are infused with nature, where we feel better every day, where we work better every day, where we're kinder to each other every day. We have our ability to imagine a good future has atrophied. Sometimes with good reason, obviously. Lately, it hasn't been pleasant. But I've become convinced over the last 15 years, talking to a lot of audiences all over and with them, that if you ask people, what does the far future look like? Tell me the images that come up in your mind. Almost always those images are looking like Blade Runner, Mad Max, at best the Hunger Games, or at least there's a few trees and robotic birds in the Hunger Games. But it's always this post-apocalyptic view of the future. I've yet to meet somebody who has a beautiful view of the future. It's all this post-apocalyptic stuff. So I've become convinced that we are trapped in a dystopian trance. And we've got to snap out of that. And the way we do that is to come up with ways to imagine not just a sustainable, but a beautiful, nature-rich future. We need to involve kids in that. We need to involve all kinds of folks in that. And people who work in urban forests, in urban forestry, can be among the most important leaders in helping us imagine a beautiful, nature-rich future, because you're already doing it. And I know it gets difficult because there are so many obstacles, so much turf warfare between agencies of, parks agencies, school districts, all of that. It's so political, it's so difficult. You can't say anything without getting harassed on the internet now. I understand. But we've somehow got to activate the very human ability to use our imagination to take the first step toward that nature-rich world.
Well, that's a perfect closing thought. And once again, we can't say thank you enough. I really appreciate you taking time from your contribution around the country and around the globe to contribute to us today. And I think there's some great things for our folks to listen to and, chew on and learn from. And I might steal a few things if you don't mind.
Have at it. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you so very much, Rich. Really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.